A young man goes into the wilderness in search of discovery and meaning. Does he find what he's looking for? I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that is from a familiar author, certainly one of my favorites, if not my favorite author. Although don't tell John Steinbeck that I said that. Not that you could, he's dead, but that's beside the point. But today's book is all about the Old West and hunting buffalo. I am referring to Butcher's Crossing by John Williams, which was written in 1960. I've talked about John Williams on this channel before. For more information, check out my videos on Stoner and Augustus. For a little bit more information. So I won't go into too much detail, but for those who don't know, John Williams was an American author who lived throughout the 1900s. He was known for writing mostly just 3 to 4 books. There's Butcher's Crossing, which was his first, Stoner, which came out 5 years later in 1965, and Augustus, which came out in 1962. He did write one other book in the 1940s, but he has disowned it since then. I'm probably going to read it eventually, but he doesn't really claim the book anymore, which is interesting. And I've talked about John Williams before when I talked about Stoner, which I consider to be one of the best books ever written. I can't say enough. I can't say enough great things about it. It's just so wonderful, so awe-inspiring. Like the scope of what Williams is trying to write about here. It's magnificent. And I do believe that Butcher's Crossing, his technically like first real novel in his own eyes, is just as good, but probably not as like on the level. But I think that's up for debate. You could argue either or is good. I also liked Augustus, but not as much as these two. I feel like Augustus is in its own realm, doing its own thing, but still a pretty interesting story. And besides writing these books, he also served in the military, and he served as a teacher. And one of his students even wrote the foreword for this book, and had nothing but praise for John Williams. So a pretty interesting author. I am going to recommend this to you, but since this book is from the 1960s, I'll spoil it in the summary section. If you're interested in reading it, I definitely recommend that you go check it out and then come back to this video. It's probably worth your time. But until we get to that point, without further ado, I'm going to do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Butcher's Crossing focuses on William Andrews. He is a young man who just finished a couple of years at Harvard. He's the son of a Unitarian preacher, but he doesn't want to go into the priesthood, and he wants to really see more of the world. And so as a result, he travels to Butcher's Crossing, and he finds a family friend there, and he asks the person if they have anything they could do. That person tells him not to go out into the wilderness, to just stay at Butcher's Crossing and help them, file paperwork and such. But William Andrews is determined to find adventure, and so they point them in the direction of Miller, who is a well-traveled sort of survivalist and hunter skinner of sort. And he has an expedition that he's been wanting to do for a while, to travel to the Denver, Colorado wilderness and hunt buffalo to make quite a bit of money. Miller is a bit hesitant to take on William because he's new, but William offers to fund the expedition, and so Miller agrees to it. And he also says that they're bringing along Charlie, his friend and a fellow hunter, and a man named Schneider, who is a high-quality skinner. So he'll be able to skin all the buffaloes that Miller kills. While at Butcher's Crossing, William encounters a prostitute named Francine. They develop somewhat of a friendship. Francine wants to get intimate, but before she does, she just notes that she's attracted to William because he's younger and less hard and rugged than these other men who have become kind of bitter and jaded. And Francine notes that William will become bitter and jaded at one point, which kind of turns him off to the entire idea of being with Francine. And he just hides from her for a couple days. He then travels with Miller along the Smoky Hill Trail. They see faint traces of buffalo. Schneider isn't really positive that there's going to be anything where they're heading. But Miller is adamant about it. And Schneider also suggests that they travel to like the Arkansas Territory in order to get some water. And this story is all taking place around the 1860s, 1870s, I should point out. But Miller suggests when Schneider suggests the thing about water is that like he knows where they're going and they'll find water soon enough. But unfortunately, along the trail, they run low on water. Their animals almost die of thirst, and there's a lot of frustration, especially between Schneider and Miller. But they do finally find water, and William sees mountains in the distance, which fills him with awe. They then get to those mountains, and they have to climb up to them to get to a valley, which exhausts William because it's probably the most amount of work that he's ever had to do. And then when they get into the valley, they see a herd of buffalo, a vast herd that will provide them with a lot of money if they're able to kill and skin them. And Miller prepares, gathering bullets and just having Schneider teach William how to skin buffalo. And then Miller proceeds to kill the herd in a very robotic, routine type manner that becomes increasingly scary as time goes on. William in particular just finds it so strange what Miller is doing, and Schneider eventually says that they got enough buffalo, more than they can carry back. But Miller says like they'll leave when they finish killing the buffalo because this is quite a bit of money here. And we also see William trying to skin the buffalo with mixed success. He gets a lot of blood on him in the process, but he does get better over time. Miller is still doing his routine, and finally he kills one buffalo when they notice that it's starting to snow, that they should have left a little bit ago, which upsets Schneider and also Charlie because he's dealt with frostbite before. And a big blizzard begins to fall. It makes it difficult for them to get out of this valley that they found themselves in. And Miller tells William that they're going to be stuck in the valley until spring. And so they're all kind of just meandering about, trying to not freeze to death, hunting for food, and trying to keep themselves occupied. And it's a generally unpleasant experience. But eventually, like spring arrives, they're able to descend down the mountain. But while they're crossing the river, which has grown since the snow is all melting, Schneider's horse falls over and then kicks him in the head, and he dies. And then to make matters worse, their wagon that they have full of food and also the hides falls over in the river, and they lose everything in the process. And they return to Butcher's Crossing with nothing really to show for it, except for some hides which they left behind at the mountain, which they do intend to go back for. Unfortunately, they finally find McDonald, and they find that the city is kind of becoming a ghost town because the railroad is no longer being built by Butcher's Crossing. And McDonald tells McDonald tells Miller and William, McDonald being the family friend that told William not to do this entire endeavor in the first place. He tells him that the buffalo market has essentially crashed, that no one wants buffalo anymore, that fad has passed, and society has moved on, which fills Miller and Charlie with despair, and William also, but he feels like he gained something from the experience. Although McDonald tells him that everything is completely meaningless in the end. He then goes to Francine. They spend some time together, but he feels like the whole journey has changed him. He no longer wants to be with Francine. And then, as a response to his anger and his despair, Miller proceeds to burn McDonald's existing hides that he wasn't able to sell because the market crashed, and he burns down McDonald's business and his home. which nobody does anything about in Butcher's Crossing. But as Miller leaves, William sees him and sees that there's nothing in his eyes anymore, that he's completely hollow. And the next day, MacDonald is trying to figure out what he's going to do next, and William decides to leave both Francine and Butcher's Crossing behind. He doesn't want to return home as he feels there's nothing there for him anymore, and he's not really sure he wants to spend life in the wilderness. We don't really know where William is going, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit worth talking about with Butcher's Crossing. It is an amazing novel filled with a lot of wonderful and kind of sad ideas, and it's very similar to Stoner, but also quite different. Also kind of similar to Blood Meridian, which I'll talk about later in this video. But one of the main themes, the sort of main idea that John Williams is getting at here, is that of man and nature, or nature's enlightenment, nature as a nightmare, finding purpose in nature. William seeks enlightenment from the natural world. He's been told by other people that there's something of value in wilderness, that it's a healthy place to be, that you can find yourself out there, and it's probably much better than what's going on in the cities at this time, as the Industrial Revolution is taking place, and it's becoming a bit of a hazardous place to live at times. And you see a lot of inspiration from Ralph Waldo Emerson. There's a quote at the beginning of the story, and William seems to be inspired by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who have been giving lectures and writing poetry about the great benefits that nature has to offer. And ultimately, William finds himself drawn there. Like he feels like if he doesn't go, he's always going to regret it. Allow me to read you an interesting quote from this. He felt that wherever he lived and wherever he would live hereafter, he was leaving the city more and more, withdrawing into the wilderness. He felt that that was the central meaning he could find in all his life, and it seemed to him then that all the events of his childhood and his youth had led him unknowingly to this moment upon which he was poised, as if before flight. He looked at the river again. On this side a city, he thought, and on that the wilderness. And though I must return, even that return is only another means I have of leaving it more and more. And that's a very interesting quote, kind of indicating that William thinks he's going to find some meaning here in Butcher's Crossing and the wilderness, and he's kind of leaving the city behind. And even if he ever returns to it, he'll be drawn back to the wilderness, that kind of being his place in some way. And I should note that's at the beginning of the story, sort of like an underlying thesis. Like, is that actually going to be the case for William? He seems to think that he has a sense of purpose, and he does seem to feel awe-inspired when he heads to the mountains and the valleys, where he hunts buffalo with William. There's a sense of pride in seeing that, of joy and beauty. So there might be some truth to that statement, that he's kind of drawn to these areas and he loves it. However, nature also proves to be very empty, devoid of that meaning, and deadly, to the point where it almost cost William his life and the life of the people with him. You see that early on in the story when they're traveling over the plains leading up to the mountains, and William feels like there's a certain numbness growing in him, and he, like, no matter how far he travels on it, it feels like he's on a treadmill and there's nothing there. A sense that this is kind of a wasteland, a desolate place, maybe not that bad, but certainly nothing to offer William. And you also see it in the valley with the blizzard, but also before the blizzard, because there's a point where William starts to feel that creeping sense of numbness, even when he's in the valley while he's hunting the buffalo, like a routine and a timelessness where it feels like nothing matters, and there's no sense of him really being there. No essence and no interaction with other people, nothing to provide him with a sort of firmness, a ground to stand on. And the blizzard makes things worse as well, because it's trying to kill him, and there's a timelessness because he's just sitting there until the spring, waiting for an opportunity to leave this valley, and he's stuck there for a very long time. Like there's a quote at the beginning of the story in conjunction with Emerson that seems to contrast with Emerson, where Herman Melville says, like, yeah, there are tons of people who say that there's like medicinal properties to nature and that it's beautiful and wonderful, but it can also be a deadly place. It's a destructive power, and maybe it's not going to provide you with that meaning that you think there is. And that quote, in essence, is just saying there's a reason for cities. There's a reason we moved from the wilderness, thousands of years ago, into cities, formed civilization. It's because we could not be in the wilderness on our own, or like, we could not live off the land itself. We had to have society. We had to have other people. We had to have like these opportunities to build our lives and provide ourselves with some meaning, which Melville and it seems like Williams are arguing you couldn't find purely in the wilderness. I think that's what Williams seems to be getting at here. William Andrews also seems to find a lot of death and the loss of hides in the story, which seems to be like a sort of like meaninglessness essence there, where like people die, like Schneider dies, and it seems like all of this was for nothing, and they lose the hides as well. Like this entire effort, this entire journey was because of those hides, and they end up losing them. And to make matters worse, society just moves on. Like the hides were just a fad for the fashion of society. I believe MacDonald also points out people used to wear beaver hats, and then the beaver trade kind of fell to the wayside. And so this entire journey, not only for William but also for Miller and Charlie, was for nothing. They lost everything, and they had nothing to show for it. This place which formerly provided for them and gave them something to latch onto is no longer doing that. And Williams is essentially refuting Ralph Waldo Emerson here. He's saying that beauty, that talk, high talk of what the outdoors can provide you, maybe that isn't as true as they'd like you to believe. And there's a sense of ultimate meaninglessness in this story, which is its own sort of theme, but it's also connected here, where like everything that William worked for, everything that Miller worked for was for nothing. And like, You think you're going to get a lot of great things from the wilderness, but ultimately you get nothing, as they say in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. There's a really good quote that comes from MacDonald in the story. "Young people," MacDonald said contemptuously, "you always think there's something to find out." "Yes, sir," Andrews said. "Well, there's nothing," MacDonald said. "You get born and you nurse on lies and you get weaned on lies and you learn fancier lies in school. You live all your life on lies, and then maybe when you're ready to die it comes to you that there's nothing but yourself and what you could have done. Only you ain't done it because the lies told you there was something else. Then you know you could have had the world because you're the only one that knows the secret. Only then it's too late. You're too old." And I feel like that's a large part of the story too. Like in addition to this meaninglessness, is that you arrive too late to get what you think you could do. You discovered the wilderness, only now the world is slowly becoming more industrialized, and the rural areas are being phased out, and there's no real need for the buffalo trade anymore. And so, like everything that you worked for, everything that you were told by those philosophers and those poets is actually not true at all. And he goes on to say that Miller kind of realized that, and that's why he has a vacant expression in his face, and that's ultimately why Miller kind of just burns down MacDonald's business and his home in Butcher's Crossing, is because he realized none of it matters. Everything he worked for was for nothing, and he kind of blamed MacDonald. MacDonald wasn't really responsible for that, but he sees him as the being that was responsible. He sees through all the lies and all of that. And like, it's pretty hollow and pretty sad for Miller, but it's also interesting because, like Miller leaves Butcher Crossing at the end of the story. Charlie goes with him. And you could argue that Williams is saying that these are the kind of people who inherited the West, or who inherited America, who were told lies, and that like they came to realize that maybe the American dream wasn't really true. Maybe I'm kind of leaning into the American dream side of thing, but there's the idea that the Old West was a violent place, and maybe it's because these people who saw through the lies, or who feel they were told lies, or found that there was a meaninglessness, those are the people who inherited the West. which is very sad. And you can see how this contrasts with Stoner if you read the book. Whereas in Stoner, William Stoner in the book, like he goes through his academic work, his academic career, and a lot of bad things happen to him. And at the end of the story, he's like, "What was there a meaning? Did it mean anything at all?" And at first he's like, "No, it's all purposeless." But then he goes on to say, "No, it actually meant something to me. Like I cared about it, even if no one else cared about it. It still meant something to me, and that's what's important." Whereas in this story, like the characters go through an ordeal, and they come out of it with like, "No, this is all meaningless. I fought and I pushed for nothing. I was sold a bill of goods, and I'm not even sure life has any meaning anymore. It's all pointless, a sad endeavor for sad people." It should be noted that this book actually came out first. So is this a case of John Williams being like, life is meaninglessness, and then 5 years later saying, "Oh no, actually, life has some meaning. I was wrong before." I do think it's actually a case of him sort of writing about the same idea, but presenting it from both sides in a way. A very thematic author. He would also do some of that in Augustus, but it wasn't the central focus of that story. So Williams has quite a bit to say about meaning and seeking enlightenment from nature, and how ultimately maybe you find nothing from it. And I really enjoyed like reading that and seeing like him kind of refuting what so many other people have proclaimed for a long time. It's a huge effort on his part, and I think he succeeds. There are other great things about this book, particularly Will's development in the story, William's development. William transitions from an inexperienced young man whose only experience is being the son of a preacher and also going to Harvard. He transitions from that to a hardened hunter, a hardened survivalist. He survived the outdoors. He lived through the worst that nature has to offer, and that's great for him. He's seen a little bit of the world, which is what he wanted. He even acknowledges that at the end of the story, that even though he didn't get the buffalo thing, he didn't make money off of that, but that's not really what he was going for. He kind of had different motives than Miller. We also see Francine at the very beginning of the story highlight this inexperience and his potential change that might take place, noting that he's a very soft and delicate kind of man, and he's probably going to end up like these hardened, bitter survivalists, these other hunters, which terrifies William. He so much to the point where he just runs away from Francine and tries to avoid thinking about that at all. But he at the end of the story, when he reunites with Francine, he's like, "Oh yeah, that actually definitely happened, and I don't know why I was afraid before." But there is a fear, because I think the fear came from he wanted that experience without becoming changed himself. But you don't often get to control what experiences you have or how that will change you. William's trying to pick and choose what he gets there. And you see his development further when he tries to skin a buffalo. At one point he becomes bathed in buffalo blood as he's dressing it, and it's essentially like a baptism by buffalo blood, him becoming a completely different person, even if he doesn't immediately recognize it. And as I mentioned earlier, he's grateful for the experience, although the biggest problem is he can no longer return home. You have I feel like the story follows a very kind of interesting hero's arc, where you see the initiation of him going off into the woods, but he doesn't really get that return ever. He can't return home because he's a vastly different person. He's kind of seen through the lie, and he doesn't want to live in Boston anymore. He doesn't want to be the son of a preacher if he doesn't hold any value in that meaning, if he doesn't believe what he might be preaching. And he can't really go back into the wilderness because he doesn't want to deal with that either, because there's nothing to hunt. There's very little money to be made there, and again, what's he hunting for? He saw what happened to Schneider, he saw what happened to Miller. He doesn't want that to end up for him, but I do think that's what's going to happen. He's going to be hardened and bitter and live that sort of life, always wondering if maybe something else would have turned better. I don't foresee great things happening for the rest of William's life, especially after this big realization so young and this terrifying experience that he went through. It's also very important to talk about Miller, because he's a fascinating character, and I love what John Williams does in writing him. Williams does a great job of characterizing Miller and his deep fall in this story. We see early on, like, he has an eagerness for this journey because he knows something that other people don't. He knows where to find buffalo, a massive amount of buffalo from years past. He has plenty of experience to do it, and he has the people who can help him do it. In a lot of ways, he kind of resembles Captain Ahab from Moby Dick. I'm constantly referencing Moby Dick here, but you know, a lot of our authors have borrowed upon what Herman Melville did, and there's even that reference to Melville in the epigraph of this story. But Miller is like Ahab in that he knows that he wants to catch this white whale of his, which in his case is the buffalo, and he knows that he can do it, but he's kind of overestimating his abilities in the process, and he's becoming obsessed with it to the point where he's ignoring reality. Like, he's so robotic in the way that he's killing the buffalo that he sees, pretending like this can just go on forever, even though winter will set in. Like, they allotted a certain number of days to go on this journey, and they're bypassing those number of days. And Schneider's demanding that they go back, but Miller is being hard-headed about the entire thing and even threatening to withhold money from Schneider as a result. You get this big sense of the denial of reality, especially early on in the trip where they're running low on water, and Schneider's like, we need to turn back to the Arkansas territory or it's going to turn out bad for us. And Miller's like, no, I've been on this trip before. I know where we can find water. And as time goes on, like, it becomes harder and harder to find that. And it's clear that, like, Miller thinks he has the experience, and to some extent he does, but he's also overestimating his abilities, and he's kind of underestimating nature and what it's capable of doing to people. And he's completely driven in that way by the thought of the buffalo and the ultimate meaning that he might get from it, and that his life might be vindicated in some way. He might get the money that he always thought he was due but never had an opportunity to because no one wanted to join him on this type of journey. And then at the end, you see that sort of realization that it was all meaningless, that he gets back to Butcher's Crossing and realizes the buffalo market has crashed right as he got a lot of buffalo skins. He could probably tolerate that first loss with the wagon like falling into the stream, but that second loss where you can't even go back and get those plentiful like buffalo skins, he can't even go back and get those because there's no one to sell it to anymore. The market's completely crashed. Society has moved on from this man and what he's valued as important. And so he's essentially lost that meaning and has nothing to fill it with. And so he's essentially become hollow, and he resembles Albert Camus' like sort of tragedy of the absurd, where like you realize that life has no meaning and you can move on, or you can revel in that meaning or like meaninglessness, revel in the absurd, or you go crazy. You lose it. You recede into yourself, and it drives you mad. And that seems to happen to Miller here. Who knows what he is going to do after he leaves Butcher Crossing, but it is not going to be good. This man has completely lost everything, and he is a danger to pretty much everyone now as a result. I also like how John Williams writes the setting of the story, from the sort of drought-stricken plains to Butcher's Crossing to the beautiful mountain and valley, which turns kind of sort of terrifying and even a little bit of disgusting as the buffalo pile up and their bodies become rancid because they can't get to them in time, and the blizzard sets in and it becomes a dangerous place to be. Every aspect of that setting is very beautifully described and well done on John Williams's part. I do have to say there are a lot of comparisons to Blood Meridian. In this story, it's a bit more positive, but in Blood Meridian, it's described as a somewhat hellish environment that the narrator, or the main character and his posse are traveling on. It's a very sort of dangerous landscape further to the south near the Mexico border. And here it's a bit more positive, but it's still capable of killing you. There's another major difference between this and Blood Meridian, whereas the biggest danger here is the environment, whereas in Blood Meridian it seems to be the other humans. These four characters don't really pose a danger to each other, except maybe mentally speaking, because they might they're like Miller and Schneider and Charlie's sort of downfall, like their mental descent over the course of the blizzard and the wait till spring kind of threatens to unravel everyone, but they're not like a danger to each other. So I like those differences between this and Blood Meridian, but also how they share some similarities and really get at like how the Old West was not a fun and dandy place to be sometimes. I also want to acknowledge how this writing is very much end of the era type writing about the end of a majestic or maybe terrifying buffalo hunting trade that seemed to exist for buffalo hides, and how when you come into this at the end of the cycle, you're promised great things and you're delivered nothing, and again that can lead you to sort of fall into despair. But there are a couple things that aren't so great about this story. It does feel somewhat lengthy and repetitive, and in that way it does also resemble Stoner. John Williams is a great writer, but he will tell you the same thing over and over and over sometimes. He certainly loves to be verbose and write quite a bit, which again, it provides a lot of detail, but at the same time, it really drags the story down a little bit and makes it feel a bit repetitive. And I don't think it completely hurts the story here, but that's enough to, make some people kind of tune out at times. I know a lot of people call Stoner boring, and it can be, but I feel like the overall product, and especially the overall product here, definitely makes it worth reading. And then I do also think that William Andrews needs to be more of an active participant in this story. It feels like he's kind of passive and other people kind of just do things for him here. And that's kind of representative of him being like inexperienced. But I do think William could have been shown to be like developing a little bit more throughout the story. Kind of becoming more of a better survivalist, more of an outdoorsman. And here it just feels like he's just passive. It feels like a weird character at times. And I know I just said that like while also talking about how like we see his development, but I think both of those things can be true. Anyway, those are my many thoughts on Butcher's Crossing by John Williams. A high quality book. Certainly one of the more amazing books that I've read this year. I've been saying that quite a bit recently, which is good. You definitely want a lot of high quality reads in your reading career. I just love how this manages to capture the spirit and sort of essence of what Stoner did. I felt like I didn't get that very much when I read Augustus. I still like it, but it's clearly not at the level of Stoner or Butcher's Crossing here. And it was absolutely fun to read and also very sad to see like these people kind of fall. Like whereas Stoner, like he kind of falls, but he also like builds himself up. These characters do not have a happy ending. It is very sad. And you kind of hope for more, but this is not that kind of story. So very difficult read, but very interesting one, and I definitely recommend it to you out there. And this is like maybe probably set dressing for what would eventually become Stoner, but it is still a very fascinating read, and it has a lot of interesting things to say, especially about nature and meaning and stuff like that. If you have anything to say about my review here, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you and have a discussion. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this great writer or this book if they don't already know. Also, join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about books, movies, TV shows, those kinds of things. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and buffalo hunting travels. Farewell.